B.F. Skinner developed behavioral theory, which was a theory focusing on outward behavior that suggested students could be successfully trained and conditioned to learn just about anything a teacher desired. Lev Vygotsky developed a social development theory in the late 1800s that suggested social interaction among children plays a major role in cognitive development. Robert Hiveshurst identified specific developmental tasks that he believed children must master if they are to develop normally. He believed there may also be teachable moments, which are periods of peak efficiency for the acquisition of specific concepts and skills. Jean Piaget created a theory of cognitive development and believed that children learn facts, concepts, and principles in 4 major stages. The 4 stages are sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, and formal operations. Jerome Bruner postulated a series of developmental steps or stages that he believed children encounter as they mature. These involve action, imagery, and symbolism. Benjamin Bloom, author of Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, he believed that one can predict learning outcomes by assessing 3 factors. First factor, the cognitive entry behaviors of a student, which is the extent to which a pupil has mastered prerequisite skills. Second factor, the affective entry characteristics, the student's interest in learning the material. Third factor, the quality of instruction, which is the degree to which the instruction offered is appropriate for the learner. Frederick Douglass firmly believed that if he devoted all his efforts to improving vocational education, he could greatly improve the plight of African Americans. Booker T. Washington was one of the early African American educators who contributed immensely to the development of education in the United States. He realized that African American children desperately needed an education to compete in society. He founded the Tuskegee Institute in 1880. The institute provided a basic and industrial education in the early years and gradually expanded to provide a wider-ranging college curriculum. Maria Montessori. She developed her own theory and methods of educating young children. Her methods utilized child-sized school furniture and specially designed learned materials. She emphasized independent work by children under the guidance of a trained teacher. Private Montessori schools still thrive in the United States today. Ella Flagg Young. She earned a doctorate at the age of 50 under John Dewey. Ella became superintendent of the Chicago public school system in 1909, where she included vocational and physical training in school curricula. She also improved teacher training as a profession and broadened teacher responsibility. She was also elected the first female president of the all-male-dominated National Education Association. John Dewey, progressive educator, believed that teachers should put a concern for students' entire educational experience at the forefront of their planning and teaching, not just learning the material. Explain the education system in the northern colonies. The first colonial schools were developed to assure that the new generation would sustain its religious beliefs and acquire the necessary basic skills to do so. Literacy was important to these new Americans in order to assure religious salvation, and reading and religious formed the basis of the curriculum. For every child in New England, some type of schooling was available. Although citizens were obliged to pay some of the expense, those too poor to pay could also send their children to school. This was an enlightened vision considering the year was 1635. For boys, and in some cases girls, the New England's dame schools were the precursor to the primary school. Here, older women such as widows and housewives would teach children the 3 R's, frequently in the kitchen area of their home. If girls were giving any education, it was at a dame school, and likely it was in sewing and homemaking skills. Rudimentary mathematics and numbers were not viewed as having importance in the early years, at least not as important as reading and some writing, and it was predominantly boys who were taught this. School could last for a week, several months, or a year, depending on the needs of the community. Explain how Horace Mann was important to education. In the 19th century, Horace Mann fought for establishing a universal system of public education and was known as the father of American education. Mann envisioned a universal public education available to all children in the country. He believed passionately that education would bring about equality, and that through a public school system available to all, the ideals of the Constitution could be realized. Through a system of public schools, all children, rich and poor, could be offered a primarily sectarian education to enlarge their view of themselves and others, and so to build a harmonious society. Through the gateway of education, equality for all would be available and poverty would cease. Furthermore, Mann was convinced that schools should teach a common set of beliefs and moral values so as to promote harmony among different groups. Mann believed that only social good would come from public school education, and so he dedicated himself to reform education as it existed up to that point, which was characterized by a growing divide between who could afford school and who could not. In Mann's democratic experiment, education came to be viewed as a significant way of ensuring a universally informed citizenry. People who would participate in local and national politics with understanding of broad issues. Reasons that a universal system of education was appealing: 1. Promoting nationalism. 2. Promoting political enlightenment. 3. Promoting equality of opportunity. 4. Raising productivity to increase national prosperity. 5. Diminishing crime in urban areas. The constitutional separation of church and state meant that public funding of education would not extend to religiously oriented schools. In Europe, there was a history of public funding for both secular and religious schools, but this was not Mann's vision. Explain the impact of the Old Deluder-Satan Act law. In the colonial era, only the children of the elite were educated, and students were taught in a range of private schools as well as in private homes. Typically, only boys attended school. Religion was a regular part of the curriculum, and often the rationale for education was to enable students to read the Bible. In fact, the oldest legal mandate for educating children was the work of the Massachusetts colony in 1642. Requiring that all children learn to read to ensure that they were not deluded by Satan and thus failed to learn the Bible. This law, which required that a select man in each locale take responsibility for making sure children were learning to read was known as the Old Deluder-Satan Act. The impact. A breakthrough came in 1647 when Massachusetts passed the Old Deluder-Satan Act. This act required that every town that had 50 families or more had to employ a teacher for its children, who would be paid either by the families or, if the town chose to do so, by levying taxes. Towns of 100 families or more had to establish actual schools. In addition, towns of 100 families or more had to establish actual schools. In addition to teaching reading and writing, these schools were required to teach Latin grammar so that boys could be prepared for higher levels of education. This started the tradition of naming schools Latin grammar schools, and in New England there are still public schools that carry vestiges of this title. For example, Boston Latin School is the oldest continuously operating public school in the United States, founded in 1635. The Old Deluder-Satan Act refers to the importance of being able to read and write so that children would not be swayed to follow inappropriate paths of behavior. The patterns established in the New England colonies represented 4 essential beliefs about governing and administering education. The state could require children to be educated. The state could require towns to establish schools. The civil government could supervise and control schools by direct management in the hands of public officials, and public funds could be used for the support of public schools. Thus, the idea took hold early in the history of the United States that the responsibility for education reached beyond individual decisions at the family level, but rather was a public good that required stewardship.